by saying that I take a very broad view of what a technology is. A technology to me includes a pencil and all of the other kinds of things that one could imagine technology might be. And technologies play a critical role in all social movements. Even a small thing like a pencil, I want to just remind people that people like homeless people and the very poor who don't have pencils, those kinds of technologies can be really essential in communicating with each other and to other people. But more broadly, in the late 20th and the early 21st century, technologies played an increasingly important role in helping movements to communicate with each other, to communicate their message to other people, and also in courts of law. And I want to point out a couple of examples of that. One of the galvanizing moments of the American Black Freedom Movement was the photograph of the young boy Emmett Till, 13 years old, who was tortured to death in Mississippi coming down from Chicago. That image, that photograph that was circulated not only in the US but around the world, had a really galvanizing role in getting people in the northern United States and in other places involved in that movement. More recently, we've seen the ways in which low-power radio, which was effectively being shut down in the early 2000s. Low-power radio allows you to broadcast 3 to 5 miles, but it was shut down so that big corporations could get hold of it. But one thing I want to point out about that is even when things are shut down, folks manage to find ways around those things, whether they're doing things illegally, whether they're building things their own way, but they manage to get around those things in order to visualize, publicize, and to communicate with each other. So, and let me also just answer really quickly the question about plateauing. As Mr. Boyle, who was in the video, who's also here, pointed out, people in power don't want other people to have power for the most part. And so what ends up happening often with technologies is as activists get hold of them, police, attorneys, governments try to find ways to prevent people from using them. And people do find ways legally and outside the law to make those things happen in other ways. You also see something we call kind of tactical innovation. Activists are always finding ways to innovate, always finding ways to work around relations of power. So even if in the case of drones, pathways are shut down, human creativity and the desire for people to have justice often overcomes some of that.
Okay, great, thank you. Christopher, since we first started filming this with you about a year ago, you've actually changed the way you think of yourself in the drone space. You've applied for a 333 waiver from the FAA. Can you talk to us a little bit about that change and how you now see yourself as a drone photographer?
Yes, in the beginning, we had no idea how successful our company was going to become. You know, where we are now, we thought it would take us 5 to 10 years to achieve. So we became, you know, one of the more prolific drone companies in the Chicagoland area in just a short amount of time. When we first started shooting this episode about a year ago, we hadn't even made $1, you know, doing drones yet, flying them and creating media. We were only doing consulting work, and we were doing repair and technological work, building for other companies at the time. And we had not started to, you know, hire out our services for media production. We made the right connections. We really branched out there. We did a great job on our branding and our marketing, and we started working with really high caliber clients, such as the Chicago Bulls, Vice Magazine, and the History Channel too. And a lot of these clients, you know, have, you know, like, you know, say Jones Lang LaSalle and Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and some of these huge monolith companies have huge law departments, and these lawyers are vicious, and they require quite, you know, they're just ripping us apart. And you know, I'm getting into it with these legal teams, and there's all these contracts, and I'm not a lawyer. You know, I'm just an artist, and I'm technologically savvy, but I'm not a lawyer. So we saw that there was starting, you know, some of these bigger clients with huge legal teams, you know, were starting to require that we have that 333 exemption, and we have to team up with other companies that have the 333, or we had to give the business away. So at that point in time, we had to make a difficult decision. You know, are we going to stay? You know, because a lot of the companies that we work with are big companies, but they don't understand the law. They don't understand the aviation law. They just want their footage. They just want their media. They don't care about the FAA. They don't care about the 333 exemption. They don't care if you fly over Obama's house. They just want their media. And, so we thought, and we have, done a great job, but at this, point in time, it's really, really imperative in order for us to keep working with the big dogs that we're working with and generating the kind of revenue that we're generating, that we need to have the FAA 333 exemption. So I'm working on my pilot's license right now, and we have filed for the 333 exemption as well as closed set, and we should have that momentarily. Just it's a waiting game now, and everything's sort of kind of changed. Kind of at the moment, we're still the cowboy, we're still a speakeasy, and we're still working with the big dogs, but here later on this year we will be fully compliant, and we'll be able to offer that to the companies and the lawyers that want to play ball.
Dr. Perritt, can you talk to us a little bit? What we see here is that there's quite a lag between what's actually happening on the legal side and the drone technology and the adoption of drone technology, both for consumers and for people who are just playing with it themselves. Is that typical for how technology has been dealt with in the legal sphere?
Well, first of all, Yana, I'd like to congratulate you on a really good movie. I think this was a nice job. And I think the subject matter was very well introduced by the performance that we saw. I don't want to trivialize art, but I took two things away from that link the performance to what we're going to be talking about this evening. First of all is the idea that human beings, were reaching for new technology. And drone technology is the most revolutionary aviation technology since the jet engine. It's got enormous potential to help advance civil liberties and to help advance economic productivity in a variety of areas. But the second thing about the performance that links nicely to what we're going to be talking about this evening is that the two protagonists got into a fight. And there's a fight that's heating up among different interest groups about what role drones should play in our society and how they should be regulated. And my sense is that the potential of this technology is far more likely to be limited by the politics of that fight than it is by the substance of law. Now, you asked a more specific question than that, and I'll try to be responsive to your question. You asked whether drone regulation is similar to or different from other kinds of regulation in terms of whether law leads or lags technology. Well, in some ways it's different, and that's a bad thing. There are other federal regulatory agencies like the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Consumer Product Safety Commission that deal with changing technologies all the time. And their philosophy is to let the designers and the engineers and the entrepreneurs innovate. And then once you understand what the problems might be, then you issue some performance standards and you let the vendors and the manufacturers certify that they have met the performance standards. That's not the way the FAA does it. The FAA says if you have new technology, you can't put it into the market until we have run years and years of tests and you jump through all kinds of bureaucratic hoops. It's not uncommon for a large aircraft, for example, it costs $20 million and to take 5 to 7 years to go through this certification process. That's not going to work with the technology you see on the table back there. Now, the second way in which things are different is that the FAA has had a very hard time breaking away from the idea that it should regulate drones like airplanes and helicopters. And there are many things. I'm a helicopter and an airplane pilot. And I know what you have to do to be trained and to pass the test to be a pilot. I also fly drones and own 5 or 6 of them, some of which work and some of which don't. But there's very little correlation between what you need to know and what skills you need to have to fly an airplane or a helicopter and what you need to do to fly a drone safely. Now, finally, I want to just kind of put something on the agenda for us to talk about a little more thoroughly. I think it's common, and your question kind of invites the conclusion that it's not a good thing for law to be behind technology. It's a very good thing for law to be behind technology. We want technology to lead the law. Because if the law is going to be ahead of technology, what that means is that you get a bunch of legislators sitting in a room speculating, guessing about what the human problems are going to be incident to technology. And then they write a law, and they get it wrong, no matter how smart and how much they act in good faith. They inevitably are going to get it wrong, and that steers technology away from its potential. What we want to happen is for innovators to be able to take the technology, to play with it, experiment with it, show what it can do, and then find out in actual human experience what the areas of conflict are. And then if people care enough about the conflict to sue each other or get up petitions for state legislation, then the legislature and the rulemaking agencies get involved. And then we have a much better chance that the rules will match technology, and they also will match the actual problems instead of imaginary problems.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to open it to the audience if anyone has a question. Will drones ever be used by journalists in possibly in foreign conflict zones? And there is a discussion around media and drone use, so if you could kind of explain some of the background to that as well.
Well, they are now. I mean, one of the exciting potentials about drones is their capacity to enhance news gathering. I mean, everybody knows that an aerial view of news is especially compelling. One of the news helicopters that flies over Chicago every day costs about $2,000 an hour to operate. You can get a Phantom 3 like that for $1,200. Buy it outright. So the journalists, both domestically and abroad, are making effective use of this.
Dr. Perritt, one of the things that I think you've been talking about is the importance of regulation, and the importance of regulation that actually speaks to the needs and the interests of all of the relevant parties. One of the problems for political activists, though, is that the police and other people in power often regulate in ways that prevent ordinary people from having access to the same kinds of things. And it's also the case that technologies that activists and police, frankly, have hopes for, that they'll be able to be, for example, truth machines. If you can only get a good enough picture, if you can only film the cop with the badge, if you can only film in particular ways, you'll be able to win the battle. But that turns out to be actually much more complicated. Even having these technologies does not always reveal truth in some sense. For example, you can have people taking pictures of the same event from 6 or 7 or 8 different telephones, and when that gets to a court of law, people are looking at those images in all kinds of different ways, and they can be taken apart, used in all sorts of ways. Similarly, even if you have a wonderful shot from above, and that's a very compelling shot to have, that may not be enough to compel the changes that people want. My point is that these things also have to be put in the context of their legal use, but also in the context of the kinds of political arrangements, legal and extra-legal, that are often realities on the ground.
Well, I completely agree with you, and this technology is hugely democratizing. It's beyond the means of any of us in this room to go rent helicopter time tonight or tomorrow, but any of us, many of us could go home tonight and order a Phantom 3 on the internet and have it tomorrow or Monday at the latest. And the reality is, it doesn't make any difference what the FAA puts in the rules. There are 380,000 of these little drones that have already been registered in the FAA's database, and there's no way under the sun that the FAA has enough inspectors, even if they combine with all the local police in the country, to enforce those rules against people who fly drones in their backyards. It's completely impossible. And the important thing is for the FAA to recognize that and to come up with a kind of approach that harmonizes what people need to do and what people want to do with the content of the law.
And I also just wanted to add to your question about news gathering in other countries. America is one of the slowest countries right now in the regulatory area as far as unmanned aerial vehicles. Canada has already, released their rules for commercial use. We're seeing commercial use in South Africa and many countries in Europe as well as Australia. So as far as news gathering is concerned, It would just and also the FAA has set up some test sites, several test sites across the United States for testing, and CNN and a couple other of the news agencies are now testing UAV technology for news gathering and reporting their findings to the FAA so that they can help with the news gathering sphere. But in other countries, some countries are a lot more liberal as far as law, and other countries are a little more strict. Before you go over and put your aircraft up and want to do some news gathering, you probably want to look into the laws and regulations of that country. But other countries are a little more relaxed, and their government isn't as strict, and you can go and, like Mexico, and you can go and put your unmanned aerial vehicle. There's a lot of South American countries as well, where you can just go and sort of have the freedom to, fly, and places like that would be more welcoming to news gathering than a place like Syria or, the Middle East.
Great, thank you. So we'll take these two questions and then send it back. Go ahead and then. Great. The questions are, what is the line between an amateur drone photographer and a commercial drone photographer? And then the second question is, what is the status of the local drone ordinances, which two of these fellows helped work on. So go ahead.
Well, let me speak to the ordinances first. We dodged a bullet in the Park District Commission last summer, and that was only the result of the fact that Christopher scared the Park District badly. Everyone expected that ordinance to pass, and then Christopher and other people were so passionate in their opposition to it that they tabled it. And I had some meetings with the lawyers for the Park District Commission, and I think that we were making some progress in getting them to understand that people ought to be able to do things like fly drones for fun in a public park. There are ways to do it safely, but you don't just ban it, and you don't charge $100, and you don't require people to have $1 million worth of insurance to do something that ought to be a perfectly legitimate recreational activity with new technology. Now, the Park District activities got overtaken by a proposal in the Chicago City Council that initially was very, very bad. It basically would have banned drones anywhere in the city of Chicago. And fortunately, some of us had an opportunity to work with the aldermen and with the staff, and the result that we got in November, the City Council adopted an ordinance in November, is very good in my view. In fact, it's a model for the rest of the country. Now, it has restrictions in it, but the restrictions are the same as the restrictions that the FAA imposes. And part of our argument was, if you, the city of Chicago, try to go beyond what the FAA has done, it's preempted by federal law. It's outside your power under the Constitution. And so what you should do is just take the FAA limits, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, but take them and write them into local law, and then the local law enforcement people can enforce it. I expected that after the City Council acted, that the Park District thing would come back to life, and I've communicated with the lawyers, but so far nothing's happened. And I think that would be, that would be fine if it stays that way. If the Park District decides to do something, I'm hopeful that the City Council model will be used. In my view as a lawyer, any permit and fee system is quite clearly preempted by federal law, at least as it applies to people that have Section 333 exemptions. Now quickly on the hobby versus professional. You may be a professional photographer, and I'm sure you work very hard at it, but you're entitled to have fun, and you're entitled to have hobbies. And there's no reason that you can't get a small drone and fly it for fun, in which case it's completely unregulated by the FAA. That's one of the strange things about this. You could take even that big S1000 back there, which costs about, well, with the gimbal and everything, it costs about $15,000.
15, 20 grand.
Okay. So if you wanted to spend 15 to 20 grand on your hobby, you could buy one of those, and as long as you did it just for fun, you could do absolutely anything with it. Fly it over airports, fly it over crowds of people, fly it to, I don't think that'll go to 20,000 feet, but you could fly it very, very high. On the other hand, if you bought one of those little things that was part of the performance and used it to take a shot to enhance some of your professional photography, that would be illegal, unless you got a Section 333 exemption. That's nuts. And the politics has made it difficult. The model airplane community is very powerful politically. And they scare the FAA worse than Christopher scared the Park District. So that's really why we have this dichotomy. Now, to be a little more direct, I think if you use the drone in conjunction with your photography activities, the FAA is going to take the position that that's a commercial use and it's illegal unless you get an exemption. If you're doing it in a way that is obviously separate from your commercial photography activities, then I think you're okay.
And I just wanted to add to the professor, as far as the Park District is concerned, yesterday I just gave a presentation to the IAPD, which is the Illinois Association of Park Districts, to about 50 plus park districts across the state. I've been reaching out to the lawyers at the Park District in Chicago, as well as their permitting department and the Committee on Finance in the city, just to try to see what was going on with where the ordinance kind of stands. And I think the city sort of kind of stepped in and the Park District's kind of still waiting things out. The Park District did reach out to me in January and said they wanted to sit back down again and continue our discussion from where we left off, but I haven't heard back, so I'm just sort of kind of waiting from them. I just reached out to them again yesterday to invite them to my an hour and a half webinar on the drones in different park districts across Illinois, and I haven't heard back, so I'm just sort of kind of waiting, it's just waiting to see what they want to do. From another prolific aviation lawyer in town, I heard from him a couple of days ago in an email, and he said the Park District told him that it's illegal to fly in any of their parks and that there's a $500 fine, but I think that's baloney. If you look on Instagram every day, you see it's Chicago, Chicago, Chicago. There's drone pictures galore. People are flying anywhere and everywhere. As far as your business is concerned, I was kind of in the same boat. I spent close to $100,000 to get going, and dropped a lot of money, and I didn't have time to wait for the FAA. Like also Professor Perritt said, the FAA, they take precedent over the city, state, and local governments. So, these guys really cannot, this FAA is really the only authority that can regulate, the airspace in our country. So, and like he said, they don't have the manpower to police, all the commercial use. What they're really worried about, their main objective, the FAA, their main purpose and their goal is to make sure that our national airspace is the safest airspace in the world, and that to minimize risk to manned aircraft that are already in the millions and millions of flights that are going on in our airspace. And they just don't have the manpower to enforce, every guy that goes out and buys a Phantom 3 and is flying around. I think what they are worried about is careless and reckless operation. So like the guy that buzzed Lollapalooza, people that are doing, careless and reckless things, flying over people, flying over festivals, flying over, doing things that are, if a motor failed, God forbid, or the thing were to drop or something happens, that they're flying out in open areas. They're not flying over private property. They're not, they're just doing things, just going out and doing it, for their hobby or for the fun. And maybe if it is a business, there are thousands of these commercial companies. And the other thing I want to say is, I'd say 70% of the people with the 333 exemption aren't following the rules. You have to have a licensed pilot to have that exemption, and it's $10,000 to get a private pilot license, about $4 to $5 grand to get a light sport. The hot air balloon license is really the cheapest, and that takes time and money. And most people that have this 333 exemption still aren't following the rules. You have to stay 500 feet from all persons, property, or structures on the ground, as well as have a licensed pilot flying your drone for you. And most companies don't have the revenue to afford that, and they don't have those connections. So most people are going out and getting the 333 exemption to say they have the 333 exemption and just kind of, okay, FAA, we got you. We're following the rules, but they're really not. So, and that's why it's such a gray area, and that's why it's ridiculous, and that's why it's just sort of a pain in the ass to do the whole 333 exemption. But it is what is required, and the FAA's eyes, if you're doing drone photography, videography, anything to better a business or for a commercial entity, it is illegal in their eyes. But like I said, they don't have the manpower, and they kind of back themselves into a corner.
But there is a safety issue here, and I think that Christopher is a very good role model for the rest of us in two respects. First of all, even in the movie, I had the sense that you hadn't made up your mind at the time whether you were going to get a 333
I did not,
exemption.
no.
You certainly didn't have one then. But the rest of it was about how you fly drones safely. And none of us want people to be flying, especially that big one back there, the S-1000. No one wants someone to be flying that in the approach path at O'Hare, because that can cause some real damage. And furthermore, I wouldn't want that to fall on my head. I
Nope,
wouldn't
it's
want
24 pounds.
even one of the smaller ones to fall on my head. And if people fly safely, the FAA does not have the resources to make a test case out of you. So they're going to use prosecutorial discretion to discriminate between the people who fly safely, even though they may technically have violated the law, as compared to the people who fly in the approach path of O'Hare, who jeopardize a bunch of people.
And they will make calls. There have been several Chicago drone companies that have got calls from the local FISDO, which is the Flight District Standards Office, and saying, hey, Mr. So-and-so, hey, we saw your videos on YouTube, you know, now, you know, it's illegal to fly your drone commercially.
I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Moore.
Yeah, so I just want to make one point about this, that one of the most exciting things about the drones, are, at least from a political standpoint, is not the question about the commercial licenses for them, but the fact that people can fly drones without a license, right, if they're doing this for non-commercial purposes. And I think that's a very exciting development for civil liberties reasons, that people are able to watch the police. They're able to also watch the same things that the police are watching, and to do a variety of things that people should be able to do. That is, to view what is happening in public events and in public places. And that is something that people, the wonderful performance again that you mentioned, people are hungry for and want to participate in, and want to do this for purposes not only of civil liberties, but also for fun as well too. So it is a really exciting innovation, and I am hopeful that people will continue to be able to use these things for the purposes that they'd like to use them for, again, with safety. And I also want to say too that, you know, folks should know about what the formal rules and laws are about safety. But as these things become cheaper and more available to people, people are going to be doing more DIY, teaching each other about what it means to be safe and how to be safe, right? So those are other things too that the FAA is going to have more trouble trying to regulate and figure out. But I also want to encourage people who may be thinking of using these for these other purposes to be thinking about the safety of others as a primary goal, as well as the other issues related to civil liberties.
Thank you very much. We have 3 questions, so we're going to go through them all. Great. So to summarize, what's the situation with insuring drones, and particularly how does risk management play into that? Should we be democratizing surveillance by citizens? And then police drone use and how expansive that is. And I'll go to Dr. Moore first and then work our way down.
So let me start with the first question that was asked, which is a question about who wants to be surveilled? I don't know the views of everybody in the room, but I think that's a really important question. The questions about cell phones, about other kinds of things, as soon as we're using electronic devices, we are simultaneously communicating and being surveilled, whether by a company or potentially surveilled by other people. And I think that's a good question about whether we all want to be participants in this, and of people who we might not like or whose views we don't like. But I think one of the things that is happening is that there is more capacity to see, to hear, right, to observe what other people are doing in a society. And at this point, it seems to me that one of the things that we need is, I do agree, regulation that says you can do this and you can't do this. I think that's very helpful. I also know, and I think everybody here knows as well, that technologies get used by people in ways that their original planners did not intend, and things that are outside of the means of the law. For example, the dark web, right? So the dark web, going to places where people are not locatable, to be engaging in legitimate transactions of various kinds, but also to be engaging in transactions that are deeply problematic in illegal activities. So the larger question about whether or not this is a good thing to have more surveillance, I think the question is, there is more technology. It's here. There are lots and lots of these things that are out there. And how we think about what the rules should be about using them and not using them is an important, not only legal question, but I think a question of ethics. I know somebody flew a drone in my neighborhood recently, and I was, outside in my bathrobe and, doing who knows what, putting some mail out, and I was quite alarmed by this, and also had a similar feeling. It would be great if they would watch people doing things problematic, but why are they flying in my neighborhood looking at me in my bathrobe? But I know that there are, those are things I think we're going to have to collectively make decisions about rather than saying no to the technology. It's a question of how we want to regulate what people can and can't do with it. And then I also want to answer the question about the police. So the police in every possible place that has any money have drones increasingly. So big cities have them. New York City has lots of drones. I say that I used to live in New York City and did a lot of work did a lot of political issues related to police technology in particular. So they're using them all the time. They use them for demonstrations. They're using them to go to so-called dangerous parts of the city and not in other parts of the city. They use them in a whole variety of ways that are regulated by local laws about policing and other kinds of things too, but they're certainly out there. And having other people watch the police as they're doing their drone observation is something that activists are increasingly interested in. So not only watching the same site that the police are watching, but watching what the police are doing as they're watching.
We'll start with your question. As far as surveillance and drone, I think the media has done a horrible job of kind of giving us a bad name. I've seen a lot of crap out there from these news outlets, just, is the drone spying on you? And it's like, just like I said, told the park racers the other day, 98% of people flying these things, they don't care about you. They don't care about what you're doing in your backyard. They're just probably passing over to get a picture of the landscape. They're not out here being perverted. They're not peeping toms. They don't care about you. They want to take a picture of a landscape or a building. And I understand it can be annoying, it can be frustrating, but it's just something that we're going to have to embrace as the technology, like the professor said, there are 380,000 of these things registered right now by the FAA, and they're not going away. So I think we need to somewhere, it's between ethics and law, and we just need to, meet in the middle somewhere. And I think the public needs to be better educated. I don't know where the photographer went, but he's got a giant gray lens. Could you hold that lens in the air? That's what you need to spy on people. You need a huge telephoto zoom lens. Our drones aren't flying those kind of lenses around. Our drones are flying wide-angle lenses so we can get a big, wide perspective. A GoPro-sized sensor. With these GoPro-sized sensors, from here to a GoPro, I can't even tell what that necklace is in your hand. These cameras, the sensors aren't made to spy. And with a drone, the things are so loud, if you're going to get up to somebody's window or anything, you're going to crash into the thing. It's whizzing, it's buzzing, it's loud. They're not made to spy. The ones that are made to spy and that you want to worry about are the Reapers and the ones that our U.S. military has that can stay in the air for 40 days and can zoom in to a millimeter on the ground and read your license plate. That's what you want to worry about. You don't want to worry about these hobby and these commercial drones because they're not really, I understand your concerns and I really wouldn't want somebody buzzing over, my neighborhood, or if I had a small child or something, I wouldn't want that either. But I think the public's been very, it's a misnomer, it's a myth, and it somehow needs to be debunked. And to answer your question, sir, about the laws in Illinois, the professor could probably back me up. He might know a little more than me. But as far as right now, the only law in Illinois is for hunting and fishing and wildlife. With a drone, it's been banned. You cannot use a drone to hunt or to fish or to do anything with wildlife. And in the FAA's eyes, there are two types of drone. There are civil aircraft and there are public aircraft. A civil aircraft is an aircraft that all of us would use or own or use. A public aircraft would be law enforcement, a military, or a government agency. And as far as I'm knowing, there's a process in order to fly a drone for the FAA. It's called a COA, or a Certificate of Authorization. You have to get a COA from the FAA, state what you're doing, and you have to get approved by them and have a licensed pilot and do all that. And to my knowledge right now, I don't think there are any law departments in the state of Illinois that have COAs for surveillance yet.
But there are at least two that have COAs. One is the Orland Park Police Department and the other is the Illinois State Police. Now, COWAs, I agree completely with what Christopher said about the distinction between civil and public aircraft. A COWA actually is much more difficult to get than a Section 333 exemption. And so the federal aviation barriers to law enforcement that want to fly drones legally is a good bit higher than it is for the rest of us. Second, Illinois has a law, a statute, that prohibits law enforcement use. The starting point is to prohibit law enforcement use of drones, and then it has an exception, a set of fairly narrow exceptions for accident reconstruction and search and rescue and that kind of thing. But the state statute appears, it's not very well written, but it appears to prohibit altogether the use of drones by law enforcement for surveillance. And the third point to make, which I'm sure many of you recognize, the Fourth Amendment is part of our Constitution, and it applies to state action that infringes our privacy interests. And it doesn't matter whether you're using the drone technology or whether you're using a spyglass, the Fourth Amendment still applies. And so there's a fairly large web of legal protection that protects us against law enforcement abuse of this technology. Now, that's not to say that all the cops are obeying the law, but at least I think we have a reasonable starting point for a legal framework for law enforcement use. And let me say, I mean, there's no reason drones can be extremely useful for accident reinforcement. You're not going to pay $2,000 an hour for a helicopter to do that. But if you can get an aerial view of the skid marks and that kind of thing, that's very helpful for accident reconstruction. And if you have a search warrant for an investigation and for surveillance, why should you exclude the new technology? That doesn't make any sense either. So I think that these laws that single out a particular technology. I mean, I like to say, if you think about the Boston Marathon bombing, if you think about the technology they used for that, it was pressure cookers. So there wasn't any great movement to regulate pressure cookers, nor should there be a great movement to regulate this new technology that could be used for good or ill.
Great. I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Moore, who I think has some disagreements, and then we're going to do a last round of questions.
Okay, so let me I just want to make one comment about the police. So every state in the United States regulates, as you're pointing out, what the police can do and can use. However, there are currently lawsuits in California, in New York City, in Utah, and in Alabama about police using drones. And these are drones that were used, they may or may not, they have license to be using these things. But the fact that these things, that we have an apparatus and have an apparatus of law that regulates what can be used officially, does not speak to the issue of what gets used unofficially, and about the ways in which, the point that I started with, which is that sometimes people have to file lawsuits and engage in political and legal battles in order to have rights that are on the books enforced. And I say this in part because the kinds of things that the police are wanting to use these for, great things like we would all like accidents to be reconstructed. My interest is in questions about people's right to be able to assemble and petition the state or petition other parties for their rights. And that is one of the ways in which we see police in other places around the United States that are not using them according to legal frameworks. And let me just finish by saying one thing, that while it would seem very costly for police to have to pay the price if they lose a lawsuit, large cities, I can tell you New York City, has a huge budget for handling lawsuits for police misconduct. So these are actually built into the city budgets and built into budgets so that there can be ways in which, if you violate the law, that people can be paid off. So the legal frameworks, I want to reemphasize, are critically important to establish with ethical guidelines about who can fly, what can they be used for. But those legal guarantees are not always in practice what happens when it comes to political situations, which is my specific bailiwick, not the question of what happens with commercial use or what happens when people are using a drone, for example, if there's been a natural disaster and trying to find survivors or things like that. But specifically in issues that are related to civil liberties where people are doing public political demonstrations.
Well, I think that what Kelly says is good news. Because one of the truths about living in a free society and a market economy is that you have to take the initiative. And sure, the cops are going to use drones informally in violation of the law, and that means we have to take the initiative to file a lawsuit and bring them to account. Similarly, if the public policy goes in the wrong direction, we have to take the initiative by way of political action. And in the market economy, I mentioned a few minutes ago that I thought that Christopher was a good role model in two respects, and I just talked about one respect, and that was safety. I think the other way that he's a good role model is that the benefits of this technology are going to be realized because of entrepreneurial energy. And the entrepreneurial energy is not going to come from the large corporations that have lawyers in New York whose self-interest is served by saying no to everything. I've worked a good bit with the news industry, and I know for a fact that the innovations in news gathering by drones has come from individual stringers and freelancers and people like Christopher. I mean, I have no specific knowledge of work that you've done for news outlets. It hasn't come from the organizations because even though there's some people that are motivated to use the technology, they start to use it and their lawyer from New York calls up and says you can't do it. So I think that we need to take responsibility, and that's the great thing about this group is all of you already know this, and you're already taking risks to do this. We need to take responsibility to hold people to account under the existing law, to engage in political action like Christopher did at the Park District, and some of us did at the City Council when public policy is about to go off in the wrong direction, and to the extent that we want to benefit from this technology commercially, to go out and act entrepreneurially.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a last round of hands. We have someone over here. Great, so the questions on the floor are about individual warrants for law enforcement to use drones, recommendations perhaps for where to fly in Chicago, and then a question about citizen journalism or just citizen use against police violence.
Yeah, the Ferguson situation, I think the FAA would probably argue on that one and say, you know, they're worried about all the other air traffic because the helicopters are flying around, all the news helicopters, and I think they would play the safety card, you know. We don't want a collision between a drone and a helicopter. There's a lot of, plus the FAA, like Jerry said in the thing, the FBI's got their plane hovering around. You've got, we got the eye in the sky, and they just don't, like I said, I think it's two-sided. One is to prohibit the hooligans on the ground and the people from reporting, and the other one is like a safety aspect to make sure that the two aren't colliding, in the air. And the other question was?
The other question was about where you like to fly.
I like to fly. I think it's kind of hard to fly now in the city after the ordinance came out because the whole you have to have permission from all the property owners of private property, and everywhere you fly is owned by somebody other than the city parks. So
Well, let me just interrupt on that.
All right.
Right after the ordinance was passed, a reporter from CBS asked me about that, and my answer is the same thing I would tell you. It depends on where the private property is. And private property probably doesn't extend higher than the tree line or the utility poles.
Oh, I forgot about that. That's a good point. Thank you, Professor. So yeah, now since the ordinance has come out, I guess I can kind of sleep better at night now. But a lot of people like to fly at the museum, like Adler Planetarium, sort of where we were in the premiere, out over the lakefront and then capturing the whole skyline. Our studio is located in the South Loop, so there's this giant empty field that they're going to eventually start developing down there, kind of across from the Metra and the Amtrak yards. We used to like to go under the bridge in Polk Street and go out in that field, like where all the homeless camps are, and kind of fly from there, but then we got kicked out by the Metro Police. So don't really fly over there much anymore. But the Pingtom Park is a really beautiful area because you can see the skyline from the south. Montrose Point, out on the tip of Montrose Beach. The only thing about that is there's a lot of traffic coming in from O'Hare, but they're way higher than you are, and you really don't need to worry about them. But that's kind of right in the approach path of O'Hare. But there's just so many beautiful places to fly in Chicago. It's incredible.
One of the things that happened in Ferguson was that people couldn't really use drones, but we all know about what happened in Ferguson because people filmed and recorded and used other ways of finding out what was going on the ground there, publicizing it quickly, publicizing it repeatedly, and publicizing it strategically. And I think that is really exciting and a really important thing for everybody to continue to participate in with respect to civil liberties. And if there is one message that I want to also give out, it's to keep on filming. And that has nothing to do with the law or not the law, but it is to continue to record so that people are also able to have civil liberties, to be able to do the things that they have a right to do, which is to prevent harms and ensure civil liberties for people. So thank you very much for having us today.
Great. Thank you. A round of applause for our panelists.